Africa's technology sector raised $1.2 billion in half-year 2021. It raised a further $1.4 billion in the third quarter of 2021. This according to FBNQuest Merchant Bank in their latest report on funding for the sector. Total funding raised in the first 9 months of 2021 by Africa's tech sector is more than the combined funding between 2015 and 2020. Joining us to discuss further is Abiola Gbemisola, who's an analyst with FBNQuest Merchant Bank. Abiola, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning.
So, based on these numbers, how would one describe the sentiment of investors to Africa's tech sector?
The sentiment has been quite great, even post COVID-19 2020. All we're seeing now is we think that COVID-19 has accelerated the need for businesses to be digitized. Right, as investors are also looking at that as opportunities for themselves as well, and they're massively investing in the sector. So the sort of sentiment you are seeing is not a sentiment that is based on African tech companies alone, right? It's a global sentiment. The investing model has now become more diversified. Unlike what we said before, where people want to focus on traditional traditional instruments like equity, bonds, and the like, right? Now, this time around, we're now seeing people investing in businesses, investing in crypto and the likes, right? And that's what is really driving the sentiment we are seeing across the African tech market. And of course, the market itself has a potential for the future, right? And that is what is essentially what's driving. We're not seeing that, we've not gotten numbers to say that the sector is quite profitable, right? But we think that what investors are looking out for is that in the future, this business will do great. And for themselves, they can also take opportunities by exiting those businesses through IPOs, or they could exist through merger and acquisition sales.
Fantastic. Now, we just had an image up there. I noticed that the bulk of the funding went towards fintechs as the most sought-after vehicle. Why is that?
So what we think is driving investments in fintechs, essentially, if I have to break it down to the most simplest terms, is just necessarily the case of that segment having the highest number of active users, right? So it's just a case of you develop a product, right? And then you have more people inclining to use those products across Africa, and that is fintech, yeah? And if you look at the tradition or even normal traditional banks, right? Traditional banks in themselves have a very large amount of users and are quite profitable over time. So what we're thinking is driving that investment in fintechs is people believe that over time they will be more profitable, right? And they'll be able to get more people to use them and more people to also pay for those products. And again, if you look at it, what's happening within the largest space within that segment, which is payments, right? So payment is quite massive, yeah? And those businesses take a little bit of, just a little bit of cut on the transaction, on the amount that they pay for what service, and that is quite some bit of numbers for them. And if you look at the numbers from for example, what is published by NIPS in Nigeria on the amount of transactions is quite huge, right? So that's a quite significant large space, and we're seeing a lot of investment in there. If you look at it across the African ecosystem, in September, M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service in East Africa, announced that it had over 50 million users now, right? And that's like the largest for any fintech or whatever tech company in Africa, right? You can only get such amount of users for a fintech company. And that is why investors see the potential in that sector, and that's why they're putting money in that sector for themselves.
Still on that same chart, ed tech, I noticed that the amount of money going to education technology was pretty low. It's at the bottom there, just $1.2 million for the period. Is that a concern for our education sector, knowing Nigeria's education demands jobs and so on?
It is a concern, right? It's showing that investors are not so much putting their monies into that space, right? And it has to do much more has to do with the intricacies of doing an edtech business, right? Unlike payments where you just have to do software, and then all of your activities can be purely online. For edtech, it's a different ball game. You have to be some bit of human element into it. Sometimes you have to have a physical space. You think about ULesson, a startup that was founded by the Konga founder, right? Recently, while it was basically meant to be an online play, right? They recently had to create a physical space for people to come in to do tutorials and what like. So that just means that the space is more complicated. You can't just make it online based alone, right? And again, if you look at this nature of our education in Africa, right, you still have a bit of element of poverty, right? People cannot afford to be solely based online, right? So you have to have some bit of You have to have more in terms of sort of structure on ground to run it. So it's a different play compared to what you say fintech or e-commerce or so to speak.
Okay, as far as the countries that raise the most funds, I believe, if you want to take us through that, I believe Nigeria is in the lead.
Yeah. So when you look at funding within Africa, over time, 5 countries have always been prominent in Africa. They're called the Big Five. Talk about Egypt, talk about South Africa, talk about Nigeria, talk about Kenya, and then Ghana. Right? But the trend that we saw in Q3, one country was kicked out of the top 5, that was Ghana, with Senegal emerging as top 3. Right, and it was largely due to the 200 million raise by Wave in Senegal, right? One of the new unicorns on the continent. Right, that was really essentially what drove that sort of funding to Senegal within the quarter. But if you look at it essentially, a lot of investors are very, very bullish on Nigeria, right? Over time, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt are always contend for the top 3 positions in terms of funding on the continent, and it's really driven by the fact that you have a very robust population, young people on the continent that are quite savvy, right? And then if we might maybe give some thanks to Nigeria's regulation around the banking space that encourage a lot of payments, right? A lot of digital payments as well. That's driving sort of investment. I also seeing within the African fintech space, like driving investment as well to that segment.
Great stuff. Your report says M&A activity on the continent could rise. Why is that?
Yeah, because the trend we are seeing is that more transactions continue to happen, right? And investors will not only look at IPOs as a means for them to reward themselves, right? Also reward and investors in those businesses, right? One of the trends that we noticed was that in 2020, the number of transactions that was concluded was just 5, right? If you compare that to 2019, there were 7 transactions. In Q3 alone, we recorded around 7 transactions on the continent in terms of M&As. And if you look at the trend so far this year as well, what we are seeing, we are also seeing that MIAs as well are larger than what it was previously. And what we think is really driving such transaction, which we believe is great for the ecosystem, is some investors in this business, we cannot wait to those businesses see maybe like an IPO exit, right? And those investors might want to come out of the business, so they just sell their stake. It could also be a case of more increased collaboration within the ecosystem, which is great, right? You have a number of companies offering almost similar products, right, with just slight modification, right? So maybe what we think will further drive that is when the business now say, let us come together, let us collaborate, and we achieve stronger moats for our businesses. Yeah, so that's why we think that M&As will significantly rise over time. And it doesn't really matter for you to say that the industry is still within the early phase, right? For example, Nigeria's fintech, tech industry is still within the early phase, right? If you look at the way an industry life cycle is structured, you have from the pioneer or early phase, growth, or maturing or decline. So we think for a larger extent, the African tech space is still within a growth stage, a early stage growth stage, but it doesn't matter for M&As. M&As could happen at whatever stage of the ecosystem. So for the African tech ecosystem, we think that M&As will continue to happen over time, and it's going to be great for the ecosystem and businesses.
Abiola Gbemisola, analyst with FBN Quest Merchant Bank. Thank you so much for joining us.